Now, I don't think I'll be saying anything new if I say that the world is growing to a phase in which hard powers seem to be the determining factor. The outcome of the war in Ukraine, for a large part, depends on the amount of money and weapons that are being supplied to the Ukrainian government to resist the Russian invasion. Our political future, Europe's political future, is bound up in this conflict, and it seems to be determined, for the moment at least, by very material issues such as energy infrastructure and gas prices. But what about the soft power that goes behind all this? Ideas and principles, they're at stake just as much as lives, income and territory are. And last March, our speaker of today, Mr. Francis Fukuyama of Stanford University and worldwide fame, published a much read and discussed essay in the Financial Times. And in that essay, he spoke about Putin's attack on the liberal order. And the Ukrainians, actually, in this light, will then be the defenders, not of their own country, not just their own country, but also the defenders of liberalism as well. And this was, according to Mr. Fukuyama, another reminder that the existing liberal world cannot be taken for granted. It is, as he wrote, something for we must constantly struggle and which will disappear the moment we lower our guard. And this is precisely the reason why it's so important to keep track of Mr. Fukuyama's thoughts and writing, and why it's such a great honor to host him here again at the John Adams Institute in Amsterdam. He's one of the world's leading political thinkers, and it makes his work instructive, not just for academics or people who spend most of their days reading books, but to us all, citizens of democracies who from Fukuyama's work can learn how to defend and uphold the system that grants us our prosperity and our liberty. Mr. Fukuyama's new book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, for sale after the event and it can be signed, is a clear warning sign that we should not take our own system for granted. Like no other, Mr. Fukuyama, he identifies which threats there are to liberalism, and not just those posed by autocratic leaders or autocrats who aspire to be leaders or leaders who aspire to be autocrats, but also by our own political culture that increasingly, as Mr. Fukuyama also argues, tries to lock up the individual into a fixed group identity. And to push back against that, Mr. Fukuyama offers a much-needed reminder of the virtues of liberalism and why this political philosophy is worth fighting for. And so apart from listening very carefully today to what he has to say, I recommend you follow American Purpose, which is a media platform and intellectual community that Mr. Fukuyama founded. And his contributions are aptly named Frankly Fukuyama. And by speaking frankly, Mr. Fukuyama, for instance, explains how the American democracy can move away from its crippling polarization, which I think is a lesson that we here in Europe should be able to learn as well. He also explains why he remains optimistic that eventually Ukraine will win. And he also explains why the administrative state, much maligned also here in the Netherlands, is actually something to be cherished. And I point out these examples because they perfectly capture the great relevance of Mr. Fukuyama's work. He offers a path forward at a time that democracies seem stuck. Now, all of you know, of course, I'm not going to do raise hands, but all of you know the phrase, the end of history, that Mr. Fukuyama so famously coined in the late 80s, just when Russia's previous incarnation started to collapse. But I do think maybe not quite as many people also understand the full body of thought that went behind that famous phrase. So for this, let me remind you of the warning that Mr. Fukuyama gave in his famous book, The End of History and the Last Man, all these years ago. Yes, liberal democracy at any point in time might seem supreme, but there's always the danger, and here I quote, of dissatisfied individuals that are ready to drag the world back into history with all its wars, injustice, and revolution. Well, I think we certainly have been dragged into history with its wars, injustices, and revolution, not just by a new generation of autocratic strongmen, but also perhaps by our own complacency, for which Mr. Fukuyama warned. And this raises the question of how peace, justice, and stability, the set of political goals which in the end liberal democracy serves, can again be strengthened. In short, there's actually no better time than right now than to hear from Mr. Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you very much. So thank you very, very much for that very kind introduction. I'm really grateful to the John Adams Institute and its supporters, as well as to my publisher, Atlas Contact, for sponsoring my visit. I've introduced my new books here in Amsterdam, I think virtually every single one of them, going back over 30 years now, and the John Adams Institute has been a particularly welcoming place to launch a book. So I'm really grateful for that opportunity and for all of you that have turned out tonight. I might just tell you a little story about John Adams that you might not be aware of. He was, of course, the second president of the United States. His son, John Quincy Adams, was also president of the United States, elected in 1824. The Adams family are what we in the U.S. call Boston Brahmins. They came from Boston. They, I think, both went to Harvard University. They're very well educated. John Adams could not have negotiated with the Dutch if he didn't speak some European languages, and so they were very cosmopolitan people. But John Quincy Adams ran a second time in 1828 against a man named Andrew Jackson. And Andrew Jackson was a frontiersman. He was an Indian fighter, a soldier. He didn't have a high school education, so he was rather poorly educated compared to the Harvard-educated John Quincy Adams. And he was really the founder of the populist tradition in the United States, because in that election they finally opened up the franchise to all white males. And like many politicians in new democracies, he had to figure out how to get people to vote for him. And so he gave them jobs in the post office, a bottle of bourbon at Christmas time, basically individual bribes to get people to come out and vote for him. And he set off what in American historiography is called the patronage or spoils system that characterized American government for the next 100 years. It shows that the Adams family was heavily involved in holding back the tide of populism that has always been the dark underside, in a sense, of American democracy. Donald Trump had a picture of Andrew Jackson hanging in the Oval Office because he was in many ways the inspiration, the original model for Donald Trump, by appealing to ordinary Americans and telling them that the elites, like the Adamses, were people that didn't have their interests at heart, that they were conspiring behind their backs. And unfortunately, that is a tradition that has run very steadily since the time of the Adams family up until the present. And it defines a lot of American politics today. So thank you for keeping the memory of, the other side of that argument going. So I'm going to talk to you about liberalism. I'm using liberalism in a very specific sense. In Europe, in continental Europe, it tends to refer to center-right parties that are pro, free markets, want to minimize state regulation. In the United States, it has the opposite connotation. These are left-of-center politicians that want more equality, more redistribution. I do not think that this economic definition of liberalism is the right one, or it's not the one that I use. I think that a liberal society can have more government or less government. That's not the critical thing. What is critical to liberalism is a belief in the equal dignity of all human beings, and furthermore, the obligation of governments to respect that dignity by granting to individuals rights for people under their jurisdiction, regardless of race, gender, ethnicity, and all of these other secondary characteristics. And a liberal society does this through a rule of law. The rule of law is fundamentally a constraint on powerful people. It's not the rule of law if it doesn't apply to the most powerful people in the society. And liberal societies basically are thus limitations on power. The state cannot do to individuals anything that it wants because it must follow the law and it must treat its citizens with equal dignity. And in my book, if you are a regime that follows that basic set of principles and has those kinds of rule of law institutions, then I consider you a liberal society, whether you have a big state like Scandinavia does or a relatively small state like, I don't know, Japan or the United States, all right? So that's what I mean by liberalism. And It's a doctrine that has been under considerable stress and attack in recent years. One form of that is, as Casper was saying, coming from great powers like Russia and China that have consolidated power in recent years as authoritarian states. They both made the same argument that liberal democracy is in decline, that they, by being centralized and powerful, can solve problems and give their citizens what they want. And that is a narrative that is very attractive to a lot of would-be authoritarians in Myanmar, in Tunisia, in El Salvador, in many other countries around the world. But there's also been, I think, in a way, a more insidious threat posed by the rise of populist nationalism. And in that one, democracy plays a kind of negative role because these populists are popularly elected. So this is Erdogan in Turkey, this is Orban in Hungary, this is Donald Trump in the United. I mean, he didn't get a majority, but he was legitimately elected. And all of these democratically elected leaders use their democratic mandate to attack the liberal part of liberal democracy. That is to say, they go after the rule of law institutions as the first order of business because they do not like these constraints on their own power. And there's actually been a kind of network of illiberal forces that have joined, what used to be the extreme left, communist states like China with extremely conservative states like that of Iran. What they hold in common is they don't believe in liberalism. They agree with Putin, who said in 2019 that liberalism is an obsolete doctrine. And as a result, the internal populist threat against liberal institutions has joined hands with a global authoritarian threat that gives them aid and comfort and support and so forth. And as a result, democracy has been backsliding. Freedom House, that keeps track of these things, it issues an annual Freedom in the World survey, and every year for the last 8 years, the aggregate amount of democracy in the world has declined. It expanded greatly beginning in the 1970s up until the first decade of the 21st century, but since then it's declined every single year, and it's also declined qualitatively because it's hit two of the largest democracies in the world, the United States and India, which in Freedom House's view have gone backwards. India, in its case, because of illiberal practices of Prime Minister Modi. And so there's a crisis in global democracy and in the way that we govern ourselves around the world that has, in a way, culminated with this war against Ukraine. I personally have spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the last 8 years. After Russia's annexation of Crimea and the Donbass, I and a lot of my colleagues actually thought that Ukraine was going to be the frontline state in a global struggle against illiberalism. Ukraine was a very imperfect democracy in a lot of ways, but it was a free society. It was a society in which you could criticize the government, you could say what you wanted, and you could vote for a president that was a complete outsider, as President Zelensky was when he was elected several years ago. And that made it a very, very different country from Putin's Russia. And this attack by Putin has a much larger significance than simply NATO expansion or the country Ukraine itself. I think Mr. Putin has made that abundantly clear. If you have not read the entirety of the speech that he gave last Friday when he announced the annexation of these 4 provinces of Ukraine into Russia, you ought to read it because it gives you a sense of what this struggle really is about. He doesn't talk about NATO expansion much at all. He really doesn't even talk about Ukraine. The greater part of the speech is this denunciation of the West, the liberal West, basically saying it's been the source of slavery, of injustice, of inequality, of aggression, of colonialism, every bad thing that's happened. And he goes back, many, many centuries and saying that we Russians are the ones that are actually protecting civilization against this threat. And so in his mind, this really, he obviously wants to incorporate as much of Ukraine into Russia as he can, but this is basically a war against the West as a whole, a West that he thinks is the fountainhead of all evil in the world, and therefore the outcome of this war is going to make a great deal of difference to the fortunes of democracy globally. So towards the end of the talk, I will talk a little bit more about my particular reaction. Now, I'm going to back up a little bit because, in my view, unfortunately, a lot of people, and especially younger people, that live in prosperous, stable, liberal democracies like the Netherlands, like the United States, Canada, any number of Western countries, have grown complacent, but they've also forgotten, in a way, the foundations of their own society, their own political order, and why it's better to live in a liberal society rather than an illiberal one. So I'm going to give you a defense of liberalism, and it really revolves around three virtues that I think liberalism has: pragmatic, moral, and economic. All right, the pragmatic one is very simple. Liberalism arose in the middle of the 17th century as a way of managing diversity. And actually, the Netherlands, the Low Countries, played an important part in that because after the Protestant Reformation, as you're well aware, Europe fell into 150 years of almost continuous warfare. You remember the Duke of Alba and people of that sort that were representing a Catholic order that was resisted fiercely here, and it killed a lot of people in Europe. And at the end of that struggle, a lot of early liberal thinkers got up and said, rather than building our political order around a single religion or a single doctrine that outlines the good life, why don't we agree to tolerate different views of the good life in the name of life itself? That we all want to survive, and we're not surviving. The 30 Years' War in Central Europe killed maybe a third of the population of what's now Germany. So maybe life itself would be better protected if we put these religious issues off to the side. You can believe what you want in the privacy of your own worship, but the state is not going to take a position saying you must be of a certain doctrine. Now, by the time you get to the 19th and 20th century, religion has been replaced by nationalism as the issue that threatens liberalism, because many versions of this rising European nationalism held that one nation should be superior to other nations, that it had the right to territorial aggrandizement, that it could define citizenship, in ethnic terms, in narrow terms that excluded parts of their own population. Europe fought two incredibly bloody world wars over this idea. And at the end, in 1945, again, as in the middle of the 17th century, people said, well, liberalism actually looks pretty good in contrast to constant wars over national identity, and therefore established a number of institutions, beginning with the European Union, which is based on a liberal idea that all human beings should have rights that are respected. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was passed in the early days of the UN, and that became the foundation of what we call the liberal world order, under which we've been living for the past 70 years. And once again, that pragmatic idea that liberalism is a way to reconcile people of different ethnicities, different religions, different races, and have them live peacefully together is the pragmatic selling point. Prime Minister Modi wants to change India's national identity from one based on liberal ideals of Gandhi and Nehru to one based on Hindu nationalism. Where does that leave the 200 million Muslims living in India? Well, it leaves them, actually a lot of them, without citizenship, without equal rights, and it is the foundation for a considerable amount of violence, which unfortunately has begun to spread in that country. All right, so that's reason one. Reason two is a moral reason that has to do with why we believe that all human beings, why liberals believe all human beings have a basic dignity, and that has to do with the question of moral autonomy. In a sense, this goes back to the book of Genesis. It's very deeply embedded in this whole Judeo-Christian tradition. So Adam and Eve are told by God not to eat of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. They disobey God, they sin, and then they're cast out of the garden. But this has a kind of, it has a consequence. They did sin, but they demonstrated that human beings actually can make moral choices. They can distinguish, they have knowledge of good and evil, and they can choose good over evil if they do right. And that capacity for moral choice is not enjoyed by animals, by plants, by any other part of created nature, but it is fundamentally the basis for the dignity of human beings. We may differ in our looks, in our skin colors, in our backgrounds, the languages we speak, but all of us have that same capacity for moral choice. That's what gives us dignity, and that is what needs to be recognized. And so that's the moral argument for a liberal society. Then the final argument is an economic one. Among the rights that liberal societies recognize is the right to private property, the right to transact commercially, the protection of commerce, and through a rule of law. And it turns out that this is a very good formula for economic growth. And so it is no accident that the earliest liberal societies here in the Netherlands and in England, you had the beginnings of first the commercial and then the industrial revolutions that led to the enormous prosperity of the modern world. And even in China, so, today's China is in no way a liberal society, but they would not be where they are today economically if in 1978 Deng Xiaoping had not introduced certain liberal principles like the right, it's not strictly speaking private property, but peasants could keep the fruits of their labor on their plots. And because they had that incentive, Chinese agricultural production quadrupled in the space of the next 5 years or so, because people were allowed to follow their own self-interest. And to the extent that China has grown as rapidly as it has, it is because it has embraced a market economy. And one of the big dangers for China now is they're clamping down on that market economy and putting it under the control of the state. So liberalism is good for economic prosperity. All right, so I've convinced you now. You've got 3 good reasons to want to be good liberals. But why are we in this current situation where a lot of, for example, my students feel that liberalism is, that may have been good in your generation, but, it's just become kind of old-fashioned now. Why do people think that? And the argument that I make is that it has to do with 2 deformations of liberalism in which basically solid liberal principles were expanded to a point that were not supportable. And there was one on the right and there was one on the left, and these 2 expansions and deformations then bred opposition that I think has put us in our current situation. So the first deformation has to do with economic liberalism. So as I said, liberals believe in private property and property rights, in the freedom to transact. But beginning in the late 1970s with the rise of Margaret Thatcher and then Ronald Reagan, and also the Chicago School, a group of economists like Milton Friedman, Gary Becker, George Stigler, that gave an academic respectability to this kind of market liberalism, you had a period in which public policy was devoted to shrinking the public sector, to taking away many of the social protections that had existed in liberal democracies up to that point. Thank you very much. And by creating a world of fluid global capital, created a kind of global capitalism that exacerbated inequalities, particularly in Britain and the United States, where, which were the early adopters of this kind of more or less unbridled market competition. And it's not a surprise that these are the 2 countries that then become the hosts of the counter-reaction. You get it partly in the form of a left wing, Jeremy Corbyn or Bernie Sanders, but more importantly in terms of a right-wing reaction that is socially based on those people that were left behind by this expanding global economy. And so neoliberalism, it's not the same as capitalism. You can't have a modern economy without capitalism, but neoliberalism was a highly destabilizing force. The deregulation of the financial sector that began in the late 80s and continued through the 1990s led to a world of fluid capital. The world had not experienced serious financial crises really up until the sterling crisis in the early 1990s. And then every couple of years there would be another country that would succumb to rapid inflows of hot capital that then would be destabilized when that capital moved out again. The Asian financial crisis, culminating in the subprime crisis in the United States, where it came home to roost in the country that had been the biggest advocate of these kinds of neoliberal forms of deregulation. And it created, again, a lot of resentment because a lot of people lost their homes. Their mortgages went under. They lost their jobs in the subsequent recession. And the people that were running the hedge funds and the asset managers and so forth that, in a way, created the risks that were taken, that were the cause of the crisis, had a rough, 9 months or so, but then in another couple of years, we're back to making tons of money. And so that, I think, basic inequality is what fueled the rise of a populist, both right and left, that resented very deeply, the injustices that it perceived was due to this kind of neoliberal doctrine. On the other side, you had an expansion of this basic idea of moral autonomy to a point that I think was also not supportable there, and that takes the form of modern identity politics. Now, I want to make clear that there is a form of liberal identity politics. The civil rights movement in the United States was based on, identity as an African American. People were they were mistreated as a group because of their group characteristics, and so they banded together in a civil rights movement that then pushed for legislation that allowed black people to vote, to enjoy the same rights as white people, to end legal segregation. And this is a liberal victory. It's a triumph of liberal principles where a discriminated minority demands to be treated equally and through the political system, achieves those demands. And we've seen this now happen, with women, with gays and lesbians, transgender people. There have been a whole succession of social movements that have taken the cause of these marginalized groups and tried to incorporate them into a broader liberal society. However, there is a form of identity politics that is illiberal. There is a form that says, your group characteristics, the things that you're born with and you can't voluntarily choose to jettison, your race, your gender, your religion, in theory is voluntary, but for most people really is not. The faith that you grew up in, those are the most important things about you. And the society ought to look to those group characteristics before they look to who you are as an individual. And that's the point at which identity politics becomes illiberal, because it sees a society not as a collection of free individuals, but as a collection of groups that are, in a sense, in a zero-sum competition with one another for resources. And some people in this postmodernist tradition have gone further to say that the existing liberal society is actually not liberal. It tells you that you have equal rights, but it's actually a kind of shield for those, capitalist forces operating behind the scenes that want to keep people down by persuading them that they have a stake in the system when they really don't. And that form of identity politics is, I think, deeply illiberal, and it's problematic. I'm asked this frequently, so I'll tell you right up front. In the United States today, I believe the right-wing form is much more dangerous than the left-wing form, because it really has to do with, the effort to steal the last election by Donald Trump. He didn't get away with it. It's pretty clear from the work of the January 6th committee that that's what he was trying to do. He didn't get away with it in 2020, but there's a large part of the Republican Party that's working really, really hard to put themselves in a position where they can manipulate the 2024 election. And that, very acute danger to our democratic institutions is a live one. And if it's a close election in 2024, unfortunately, I think, this most basic institution of the peaceful transfer of power will be threatened. The threat coming from the left, I think, is a more diffuse one. It's a cultural threat. It usually doesn't take a political form. It takes the form of cancellation or, opinion on social media that just shuts down certain opinions and voices and, leads to a kind of self-censorship where people simply don't want to talk about a certain range of subjects, typically having to do with race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. But it really does lead to a lot of students, for example, feeling that freedom of speech, a basic liberal virtue, is old-fashioned, right? That we can't allow free speech to people that don't hold the same progressive views that we approve, and then eats away at the foundation of certainly of academic discourse, but I think of the kind of discourse that is necessary to sustain a healthy liberal society. All right, so there are two more issues I want to talk about. The first one is this cognitive question, because liberalism was associated right from the beginning with a certain cognitive mode that we label modern natural science, right? So modern natural science asserts that there is an objective world that exists independently of our subjective perceptions, that we can experience that world and develop empirical information about it. Using the scientific method, we can come up with causal theories about how that world works. And the fact that we can do this has been the basis for science and the kind of technology that then allows us to manipulate that material world and use it for our own benefit. And quite frankly, none of the material wealth and the kinds of freedoms that we enjoy in a liberal society would be possible without the scientific method and all of the things, all of the technologies that flow from it. Obviously, not all of them are good, but on balance, that's what has made the modern world possible. There's been an attack on the objectivity and the independence of science that actually begins on the extreme left. I know this very well because I studied in Paris in the 1970s with Jacques Derrida and Roland Barthes and a number of postmodernist thinkers on the right. I actually met Michel Foucault when I was an undergraduate. He came to Cornell and visited our university. But, a lot of the thought in that tradition basically questions the possibility of objectivity, that actually the world is really what we perceive it to be, that language imposes a structure on the world rather than reflecting the world's structure. And this is carried in a way to the logical conclusion in the thought of Michel Foucault, who begins to criticize modern natural science in certain domains like homosexuality, incarceration, madness. He says that these are pathologized. In the old days, rulers could simply kill a subject that they didn't like, but today you have to convince them by saying, well, the scientists believe such and such, and that's a way of getting people to do what you want them to do. So science becomes a tool of hidden, powerful elites, and by the end of his career, he had broadened this from these cases where he had a strong empirical ground for saying that science was being used this way to being a general attack on the possibility of science itself. And I think what's happened is that skepticism about modern natural science has now gravitated to the extreme right, where you have this abundance of conspiracy theories that basically take the same argument, that here all these public health authorities are speaking in the name of science, but they don't actually represent the truth. They represent the interests of a hidden elite that really wants to use science to get you to be compliant so that they can manipulate you. And therefore, the factual basis of our liberal democracy gets eroded because we can't even agree on facts. And in this case, technology plays a big part in that erosion because the internet allows anybody to say whatever they want, right? Back in the old days when media came through a much more limited number of channels, that was not possible. But today, there are a lot of bad actors that are actually trying to encourage the spread of fake news and conspiracy theories, hate speech. And the internet is very good at promoting this stuff. And actually the bottom lines of a lot of the big internet platforms depend on the kind of virality that people buy into when they say things that are outrageous as opposed to well thought out, true, and so forth. And then the last issue I want to mention just is the question of nation, because I started with this definition of liberalism as a doctrine that believes in the universal equality of all human beings. So a liberal believes that it is wrong to abuse someone's basic human rights, regardless of where in the world it happens. It could happen in Myanmar, in China, it could happen here in Europe, but everybody is an equal human being, and yet we're divided up into these nation states with limited jurisdiction. So how do you reconcile the universalism of liberalism as a doctrine with the fact that we live in nations and that we accord legitimacy to nations? And I think that there's a couple of important answers to this. That one of them is, again, a practical observation that rights really depend on enforcement. Declaring a right that is unenforceable is kind of meaningless. And that's why states are important, because states remain the enforcers of just rules. A state is a legitimate monopoly of force over territory that is able to enforce rules, and you can't have meaningful rights if you don't have a state to enforce them. But states have a limited territorial jurisdiction, and we actually do not want states enforcing rights everywhere in the world. Sometimes the United States has been a little bit too eager to try to enforce rights beyond its own borders, and I don't think that that necessarily leads to a better or more stable world. But finally, there's an emotional argument. Human beings are social creatures. They want to bond with other people, but in many ways the nation state is the largest social unit to which they feel this immediate instinctual solidarity and attachment. And without that kind of attachment, you can't have a cohesive society. Without shared values that should be liberal values, you don't have a political community. And so you need nations, but they have to be a certain sort of nation, right? They have to be nations that are built on liberal principles, where the principles are really open to everybody that actually lives as a citizen in that society. And if it's based on a narrower category like religion or ethnicity, you're going to end up excluding an important part of the population. And therefore, you need a kind of liberal sense of patriotism. And I think one of the big mistakes that a lot of liberal politicians have made is to cede the issue of patriotism and national identity to the right, and these days to the extreme right that have a exclusive and rather nasty view of that national community. And that's ground, I think, that needs to be reclaimed by true liberals. All right, so just to conclude, I want to conclude on a somewhat more optimistic note. I mentioned that global liberal democracy has been in decline for the last 8 years, but people are fighting back. And I actually think that this war that's going on in Ukraine has woken up a lot of people that were very complacent about the survival of liberal institutions and didn't really think that we'd have to pay much of a price to keep them going. And I think that the examples that the Ukrainians themselves are setting by fighting for their own, freedom has actually been very inspirational to a lot of people. And it also demonstrates why a basically free society is likely to do better than a centralized authoritarian one. In Russia, you've got one decision maker that, makes any difference. And if that decision maker is paranoid and too scared to even sit at the same table with his defense minister because he's afraid of getting COVID, he's probably not going to get very good advice about the world. And he's going to make big consequential decisions because he can and because he actually has shielded himself from any kind of feedback. and he doesn't face any kind of institutional constraints. And a milder version of that is unfolding, I think, in China with the zero COVID policy and a lot of other things that are going wrong in the Chinese economy that I think derive directly from this authoritarian style of decision-making that doesn't place limits on the power of leaders. A liberal society does that. It derives power and legitimacy from the fact that decisions need to be shared, they need to be assented to, and there's a possibility of accountability for leaders that don't take popular wishes into account. And for that reason, I actually think that, well, we can discuss this in greater detail. I think actually the Ukrainians are going to do very well, and they're going to win this war. But I do think that that may demonstrate to people that had become complacent that it is possible to fight back, and it's possible to fight back successfully. So I hope they do, and I'll leave you with that thought. Thank you very much for listening. I look forward to our discussion.
But I want to start off our conversation with something maybe slightly more cumbersome. I woke up this morning and I thought, well, I'll be meeting you tonight. So I thought, let's see what's on Mr. Fukuyama's mind. And luckily we have Twitter these days, so I opened my phone and you had posted a tweet saying, which is almost a statement of fact, saying, I think we'll see a much bigger Russian collapse happening very soon. Now, then I met you later the day, earlier this evening, and then you explained to me your own surprise on how many people responded. Like, there were 60,000 likes. So apparently the idea of a Russian collapse is something that people are interested in, engage with. So I have two questions for you. The first is, how can we be so sure? And the second is, why do you think this statement causes such a big reaction?
Well, the reason that I think that a Russian collapse, and by the collapse I don't mean the regime, I mean just the military, their military in Ukraine, it's something that I've been following extremely closely from the beginning of this war. And there is such a difference in the motivation of Russians and Ukrainians. The Ukrainians actually, many thousands of Ukrainians returned to Ukraine when the war began because they wanted to fight on behalf of their country. And they've been doing it with incredible bravery and vigor and determination. And with the Russians, it's been exactly the opposite. I mean, they think that more Russian young men have left the country than they've managed to conscript since last Thursday's announcement. And it shows up in their battlefield performance. These poor guys, if they do get caught and conscripted, apparently they're going to be sent out to the front with no training, no equipment. The Russian army has suffered terrible shortages of tires for their trucks because of corruption, on the part of the officer corps, and extremely bad leadership. And so if you look at where the Ukrainians are pressing, the big theater is the city of Kherson in the south. That's key to opening up the Black Sea coast of Ukraine. The Ukrainians have basically had the Russian force there cut off. There's 4 bridges across the Dnipro River that resupply that force, and they've bombed all 4 of those bridges now for the past month. So the Russians cannot resupply that, the 25,000 men that are there. And they're also making, gains up in the north as well, pushing back the Russian advances from this summer. And I just think that the level of panic that's evident among Russian elites right now, and when you read their military bloggers, that's the only honest view that you get of what's really going on in the Russian military. And those guys are in a panic because they see around them, units collapsing, people surrendering, and so forth. And, that's what happens to armies. They don't just slowly fade away. At a certain point, they just collapse entirely. And I think
almost like democracies.
Yeah, well, democracies, you got to plan a little bit harder so that's why I think that the military collapse is likely. Now, is that a good thing or not? Well, morally, I think it's certainly a good thing. It would serve the Russians right, but there's no question that we're in a very, very dangerous, global moment because Putin has very few ways out of his current dilemma. And one possibility obviously is escalation to nuclear weapons. I personally find it very hard to understand how this actually helps him, because, the Western reaction to any use of nuclear weapons will be devastating. It doesn't need to take the form of another nuclear attack on Russia. There's lots of other things that NATO could do that would be very, regime destabilizing in response to a move like that. And I think that Putin probably understands that. So for that reason, let's hope, that, he will be rational and not move to that. The other longer-term issue is what happens in Moscow itself. Right now, there's all of this finger-pointing and backbiting among Russian elites as to who's responsible. There's now a general recognition that they're facing a disaster. And what emerges from this is really hard to know.
That is very interesting, of course, coming from you, because this essentially brings us back 30 years ago when you were working in the US State Department and observing the collapse of the Soviet Union, and your whole end of history thesis was built, I think, on that experience.
Right.
Do you see any parallels?
Well, there are some. There are a couple of critical moments in my career when I've been willing to stick out my neck, but there is a parallel, because I was in the State Department in 1989, and I remember we would be getting all of these reports from Eastern Europe, the Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, bringing us news that there had been a new civil society organization, that yet another demonstration had been held. There were more people streaming out of East Germany. And it just struck me that once you had the Polish and Hungarian transitions, the idea that East Germany would be this bastion of communism that would survive just struck me as ridiculous. But everybody in the State Department assumed that East Germany would be there forever. I was actually in a NATO planners meeting in late October of 1989, and the German representative said, German unification will never happen in my lifetime.
Well.
And 11 days later, it happened, right? And so there's sometimes when reading the tea leaves, it's not even reading tea leaves. I mean, it's so obvious what's happening that, you feel relatively safe. And I feel pretty confident. I mean, the Russians, I think, are going to have a very hard time recouping this military setback. And now everybody else is onto this. And so I think that kind of explains why,
And like I say, based on that experience, you entered the world as Mr. End of History. Can we already see what will come after this Russian collapse? Are you already pondering on the theory of, is it a repetition of the previous cycle, or are we starting a new one?
Well, it's hard to say. I think that certainly the collapse of Putin and Putinism will be a blow to global populism, because all of these populist leaders, not so much Giulia Meloni, but certainly Salvini, Eric Zemmour, Marine Le Pen, Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, they all like Putin, right? And they like him because he's a strong man, and if he proves to be the biggest strategic fool of the 21st century, he's not going to seem like such a great model for them and something that they should aspire to. So in that sense, it's good. It will probably mean more freedom for those countries that were under Russian influence, through various, social media operations and so forth. So all the Kazakhstans and Georgias and, places like that, it'll be good for them. And I think it'll be good, for us as well, because it is going to demonstrate that you can fight back successfully. What we don't know are the follow-on, political consequences. If there's a actual regime change in Moscow, it could be for the worse,
Yeah, we've been using the word fight, the fight for liberal democracy, fight back against the threats to liberal democracy quite often this evening. And apart from the obvious fighting that's going on in Ukraine, one of the questions I had before coming here today was, the audience we have here, I think many of the people will subscribe to the idea of liberal democracy and will be convinced by your moral, economic and pragmatic argument. But what can an individual citizen in a liberal democracy just like us, what can it do to sustain that model? Like what is the task for ourselves?
Well, there's several things. I mean, individuals are pretty powerless, but we organize in civil society. And so we create, these networks of organizations and like-minded people that can do a number of things. So we can advocate, for good policies. There's been an impressive amount of advocacy for more support for Ukraine across the whole of Europe, which I think has been a really wonderful thing to see. What we do in my center at Stanford is that we've been running educational programs, leadership programs for Ukrainians. This was before the war, but we wanted to help strengthen democracy in what was a pretty corrupt and poorly governed country. And so we figured that we could help them by, helping to train a new generation of leaders, and that's paid off actually in rather interesting ways. But every civil society organization supporting women's rights, look at what's going on in Iran right now. Mm-hmm. At very least, everybody in Europe should be aware of, the struggles that are causing all these women to get out in the streets of all of these Iranian cities under what is just an absurdly repressive regime, and give them moral support, show them that, their struggle is not going unrecognized, to try to hold, the people perpetrating the abuses to account. There could be material help that, a lot of their groups could be given. So I think, and then there's another part where we just have to pay attention. There's a lot of countries that have kind of slipped under the radar. I was just in Moldova, so it's nice. They're given candidate status for the European Union, but actually they're in a big problem because they've got the first democratic, non-corrupt government in their history under Maya Sandu, who was elected a couple of years ago. But, they're completely dependent on the Russians for gas, and unless somebody reaches out and helps them, they're not going to survive as a democracy. And so, again, that's something that people could pay attention to, advocate over, and ultimately, governments can help.
Yeah, and that is sort of, say, our global role. But what can we do with the citizens in our own country who seem to be giving up on livable democracy?
So that's a different and a really important question. So the first thing I would say is that we need to understand what the causes of this kind of populism are, because there are illegitimate motives and there are legitimate motives, right? So an illegitimate motive, let's say back in the United States, is I don't like the fact that there's so many minorities, coming into power, getting elected, being put in positions of authority. I didn't like the fact we had a black president, and I want to go back to the country the way it was before all this stuff happened. That's illegitimate. On the other hand, I think that educated, cosmopolitan people that live in big cities that are exposed to a kind of global society do tend to have a kind of cultural contempt and look down upon people that are not like themselves. And I think that if you look at the yellow vests in France, or a lot of the truckers, that launched the protests in Canada, or a lot of Trump supporters, they're not hardcore racists or xenophobes, but they're people that have more traditional values, that feel that they are not being respected, by the elites that are really running, the commanding heights of their societies. So I think that understanding who they are and what is motivating them is a beginning point. I don't think that you can reconcile, you can't give in to a lot of the populist policies that are very destructive, but if you have a better understanding of why people are upset, then maybe you can make adjustments in your policies that would build a bigger coalition to make sure that the most extreme politicians don't end up being the ones that get elected.
Yeah. Let me add to that something which struck with me when I was reading your book. By the end, you make the case for the virtue of moderation, not wanting anything in excess. which I thought was a very interesting way both to conclude your book, but also to bring into the debate on how to sustain liberal democracy, because that seems to be going against the grain of I think, how the ways of how we live, how we think of ourselves, how we operate in society. Is that the starting point, maybe, for the...
Well, as a personal virtue, yes, I think that's important, moderation. So it was one of the 4 key virtues that the Greeks believed in, but it's not something that many modern people believe in. There is a view, I won't go into the history of where it came from, but there's a view of the modern self that each one of us contains this creative, struggling, expressive inner self that's struggling to get out, and that you really need to let that out and to follow it wherever it goes. I think that, this is something that, I don't know whether in this aula graduates are told this, but certainly in American universities, the typical graduation speech says, well, go follow your passion, wherever your passion leads, go follow that. And that may not be the best advice because, Hitler followed his passion, and look at where that got us, right?
Well, what would you say to the graduates?
I would say that you should regard moderation in all things as one of the virtues, that because something is good, you should treasure it and keep that as a lodestar, but it doesn't mean that 10 times as much of that is 10 times as good, right? So if you have a market economy, it doesn't mean that 10 times as much market where you take the state out of everything is going to be 10 times as good. If you believe in the basic virtue of autonomy and moral choice, it doesn't necessarily mean that your ability to make up your own moral system is necessarily a good thing, because, maybe you're going to make up the wrong moral system. And so I think that, it's still something that you can teach as an individual virtue to young people.
Okay, I think that's actually a brilliant note to open it up to the audience also. I'm sure there's many people who have questions for Mr. Fukuyama. Well, I'll explain the ground rules, or how we're gonna be covering this. I have 2 microphones. They're in the middle path. Because we have such a big crowd today, it will be difficult for me to go around, or for anybody to go around handing out mics. So, if you wouldn't mind queuing up behind one of the microphones if you indeed have a question for Mr. Fukuyama. And while this small queue begins to form, I'll take the opportunity to ask my very last question for now. I've just come back from the United States. Just as you looking at the midterms. Do you dare to wager any predictions yet, or?
Well, you're probably in a better position to make that prediction than me, since you've been following it very closely as a journalist. Biden was really doing badly 6 months ago. His approval ratings were lower than Donald Trump at his lowest point. Since then, he's come up a little bit, and in a Republican-Democratic matchup, some of the polls are showing that the Democrats may be ahead a little bit. I think that the Republican vote always tends to get underestimated in these polls, and so I do expect the Republicans to, take back the House of Representatives, although probably not by a very wide margin, but they will definitely get control of the House. The Senate, as far as I can see, is about 50-50. So I don't know how that's going to come out, but it means that Biden's next 2 years are going to be pretty miserable because he won't get anything through Congress.
Which could be worrisome for us here also.
Yeah, and the other thing that's going to happen is that these Republicans are all then going to launch these stupid, phony investigations of Democrats because they feel that, they want to pay the Democrats back for all of the investigations of Mr. Trump.
I think there's a fair chance of that happening.
Yeah.